Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report podcast. I'm your host, Vago Muradian. Our podcast is brought to you by Bell. Since 1935, Bell has been redefining flight. Learn more about its pioneering spirit at bellflight.com. Later in the program, our roundtable on the week in Washington. But first, joining us is Hondo Geurts, the Assistant Secretary of the United States Navy for Research, Development, and Acquisition. Sir, thanks very much for joining us.
Glad to be with you, Vago.
And before we start, our naval coverage is sponsored by Fincantieri Marinette Marine. Our global coverage is sponsored by Leonardo DRS. Northrop Grumman sponsors our weekly cyber report and our broader cyber coverage. Elbit Systems of America sponsors our trade show coverage, and Bell, of course, sponsors our podcast. Sir, thanks very much. You've been very, very open with reporters. You do regular press conferences. Just a little while ago, you talked to reporters again, and you talked about how your mission is to try to use this pandemic crisis as an opportunity to drive a better, more responsive, faster, smarter, and more resilient acquisition system. You noted that 95 to 97% of the Navy team is now working remotely. You've accelerated contracts. Some $30 billion has been moved up, whether it's in destroyer work or amphibious work. And also fundamentally reconsidering how you use people, right? How many people travel? Do you need to send 15 inspectors, or whether one will do? Walk us through how you're improving how you fundamentally work that will change how you work even after this crisis, and could be particularly useful in the next crisis, whether it's another pandemic situation or, God forbid, a great power confrontation.
Yeah, Vago, it's, I think, a very important point. It's, as I kind of think of this in phases, we're kind of in a delay and disruption phase right now. And we've been meeting regularly, kind of the leadership team of, while we need to manage and make sure we're completing the mission in this delay and disruption phase, our real focus needs to be how do we reset and reinvent to the new place we want to be. In my mind, getting back just to the way we used to operate is mission failure. We've got to get to a more resilient, more effective force. A lot of the ways we're doing that is experiment really quickly in this phase, find the things that are working that we weren't sure were going to work. Now we're proving they can work, double down on those, and then find the things that we thought we used to add value, but we're finding we don't need to do anymore, scrape those barnacles off, and then really rig for speed and resilience as we kind of go forward.
And so what are some of the things that you're doing? Talk to us about how you're getting not just accelerated decisions, but better decisions and better agility out of it. Because from what you've been explaining to us over a couple of sessions is pretty much everything is starting to move faster.
I think we have an advantage. We started 2 or 3 years ago to build a real foundation about decentralized execution. I had wartime planning teams thinking about what would happen in the disruption, what would be our first moves, what were keys to success. So we're building on that foundation right now. Key of that is trust and transparency, right? Trusting that folks understand intent and then can move out quickly on intent, and then transparency so everybody sees how things are going, where we need to make adjustments, where we need to move forward. I think we've got good trust with our defense industrial base. We're both partners in this. We can't do it without them. And so working very, very closely with them. And as we find best procedures, best ways of doing business, best ways of executing business, again, double down on those that are working well and that are going to be applying better in this new state that we want to be in. And then those that aren't have the courage, institutional courage to get rid of those, what used to be important practices in our minds, but really didn't truly show their worth as we kind of pressure test this. I view this last couple of weeks as a great pressure testing of our abilities, and that pressure test has exposed elements that are much stronger than we thought they would be, teleworking and team working and partnering, and then areas where we're weaker than we need to be, and that's where we need to put some effort and quite frankly, reinvent how we do some business in those areas.
So talk to us about one sort of, you mentioned, for example, telework and connectivity. Obviously, that's driven new cyber security needs and standards as well, I should point out, with the new NAVSEA directorate that's been set up. But talk to us about something that's that is sort of key lesson number one, and then one thing that you no longer think you have to do the way that you used to do it?
Yeah, maybe I'll start with the latter. I think we had convinced ourselves that we had to do a lot more traveling, that we had to all get together in giant meetings, and we had to have more group review of things than we needed to do. And so this has shown us that no, we can. We've got a great workforce. They understand intent, and they have the abilities to move out quickly without the level of oversight and deliberation we maybe had previously. Another thing we're finding that's working particularly well. We used to, if we had an issue on a ship, we used to send lots of people. And over time, we got a little bit in the habit of having to send everybody out to the ship as opposed to focus on things that could make the ship more self-sufficient. And so the things we've done in the last 5 or 6 weeks with tele support, whether it's tech support remotely, whether it's training via remote means, has really allowed us, one, to keep the readiness up without having to fly everybody around the world like we used to, and two, given, I think, more and more confidence in our operating units that they can be self-sufficient with our support as opposed to us always having to fly people everywhere. I think both of those will pay great dividends to us as we go forward.
And one of the things almost everybody's been telling me is that there are people who used to travel incessantly who actually really like the current period that we're in part because they feel that they can be more productive with their time as opposed to spending it on an airplane or in a hotel.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've got to be a little cautious. I think in the end state, there's going to be elements that we've discovered that are very effective, largely teleworked. But there'll be other areas where getting together really matters, forming a team really matters. There's areas where close collaboration may not be possible just in a teleworking spot. And so I view it as an either and, not an either or. This has opened our eyes to areas that are much more productive than many of us would have thought they would have been. But I'm also not blind to the fact that 100% telework for 100% of things is the right answer either. I think the leadership challenge is setting the conditions where both are respected and we leverage them both to their maximum potential.
Do you need fewer people in this environment that you're going into, or just people that you distribute and use differently?
Yeah, I think it's more the latter. I mean, we certainly have lots to do, but I think we can do lots. And so, this is not do more with less in my mind. This is make the most out of all the resources we have. And one of the interesting things about, this kind of telework thing is it also resets some of the, you can have dominant players in a group setting when everybody's together. And you might have the quiet person who has the data, but may not bring that to the table in the same manner. And it's really interesting to watch and I'm really proud of our teams and their ability to, quickly adapt. And in doing that, that's actually, I think, allowing us to be even more inclusive and really leverage the tremendous diversity of talent we have in the Department of the Navy. And I think that's why you're seeing us really kind of be a first mover in a lot of these areas. We've been able to transform quickly. We're all kind of operating from a good core level of trust. And, I try to produce very clear guidance. My guidance to the team is pretty simple. Take care of yourself, take care of your team, and take care of the mission. And the teams have all kind of adopted that. Take care of themselves, keep everybody safe, keep the family safe, work as a team, and then work together as a team to get the mission done. And it's really been inspiring to see how they've adapted really quickly in largely stressful scenarios. This is not a stress-free environment, even when you're teleworking at home. That introduces new stresses that we haven't seen, and certainly some of the complexity of the issues adds some stress to the execution of programs.
Speaking of stress, cybersecurity has been something that's been very, very important, and there's a lot of investment in. Talk to us about how you're ensuring that this distributed force is able to deal with the kind of sensitive information that everybody is moving and do it in a very, very secure fashion, as opposed to it becoming a sudden windfall for our potential adversaries.
Yeah, absolutely. We cannot let the challenge of a distributed operations turn into an opportunity for our enemy. And so, working hard, I'm great partnership with Aaron Weiss, Department of the Navy CIO. They've done some extraordinary things to open up pipes and get us all working. We're at 300, 400, 500% of our teleworking capacity just from 2 or 3 or 4 weeks ago. And so they're doing a great job of opening up the pipes. And then, we're proof testing a lot of collaborative tools. And I think, one of the things that will, allow us to move to where the puck's going to be kind of in this future state is really leveraging these collaborative tools in new and exciting ways. May not be new to all the business world, but in the government world, I think it's going to open up a number of capabilities. But having said that, we've got to all do that with security in mind, and not turn this challenge into an opportunity for our enemy.
You're unleashing the Navy science and technology workforce to try to develop new COVID capabilities for the force, including everything from not just dealing with, for example, sailor health, because obviously the Teddy Roosevelt situation is still ongoing in Guam, of course, and obviously the challenge is spreading to ships worldwide. It was 4 carriers at last count and a number of other ships that you want to try to get capability out to, but also capability that you guys can then use in shipyards, for example, where folks do have to work in intimate contact. Talk to us about the process of how you're trying to accelerate technology and get it out to the fleet.
Yeah, I would say, another thing that's been very remarkable is how open and transparent the America's shipbuilding community has been. They're, fierce competitors in many regards, but in the regards of shipbuilder safety, I meet with the shipyard presidents every other day, and they are fluid in sharing best practices, best ideas, things that are working. We're doing the same in our public shipyards. NAVSEA has stood up a rapid action team that can evaluate any piece of technology or a practice or a procedure, get it through all the right technical reviews very quickly, and then get that out to the fleet. And so this combination of, hey, what's best for everybody, share that quickly, and then have a process where we can vet technologies and procedures quickly and get those, whether it's in the shipyards or out to the fleet quickly, is one of the keys. And I think, again, it's focused on this particular issue, but we're also learning how to deal with unforeseen issues, which we can apply in the future to another. The circumstances may be different, the issue may be different, but the procedures and the muscle memory will be there. That will make us much more strong and resilient as we go forward.
Let me take you to the question of budget, because no Buck Rogers at the end of the day. We knew that there was going to be downward pressure on the budget even before this pandemic. Now that we do have this pandemic, we're talking about many, many trillions of dollars, not just in stimulus spending, but as well in lost tax revenue, higher unemployment rates, and potentially folks using a global depression or expecting a global depression. Talk to us about the anticipated budget impact. One of the great things about the military is you guys track the cost of everything and have a sense on where costs are going to go. So it's a 2-part question. First, where do you think costs are going to go on this? You've accelerated some contract spending. That's good because it gives stability to industry. But how much is it costing you in things you might not be doing now? Is that a $10 billion bill, a $1 billion bill? Do you think you actually end up saving money? Where do you think you're going to fall through this process?
Vago, maybe I'll one step back. My philosophy in this early on, 5-6 weeks ago was first priority, is take care of the health of the workers, and so we've been, as we talked about, doing that. Second is ensure the economic wellness, right, of the defense industrial base. And we really attack that first by freeing up money that had already been, a service had already been provided, we just hadn't paid for it. We had funds on withhold or progress payments. That's gone complete. That was an immediate injection. And then the second idea of accelerating contracts is really kind of creating stable work, and then letting work occur as it needs to in its delay and disruption phase. So in that mind, that was work we had already planned. It wasn't any new work. It was just get the work on contract as effectively and efficiently as we could. Therefore, the performers knew the work was there. They could plan for the work and accomplish the work more effectively. To me, that's actually going to save money in the long run because we've created some stability. It shouldn't cost money for us to do what we had planned to do, just do it a couple months early. Where we are going to have to work together is on understanding the impacts of this delay and disruption as it's occurring, whether it's in the supply base or at the major industrial operations. And we'll work our way through that element of it. But I do want to shoot for a place where we don't just pay delay and disruption to go back to where we were. We've really got to focus on actually increasing efficiency and effectiveness. So in the end, we're not going to just wind up, where we were in a worse condition. And that's really kind of where the focus is. And I think, just like we're learning, I'm seeing in the industrial base learning things that they didn't think were possible actually are. And I think those are all opportunities. I view a little of this also as an abundance thing. So yes, we may have a higher than nominal unemployment rate, but we've struggled for years to get talent at the numbers we need into this shipbuilding workforce or into the aviation workforce. So I think there's an important role the Navy can play and the Department of Defense, one to help us through this, not necessarily be hindered by it.
And obviously, right, an outstanding, there's a large number of high quality jobs that folks may, you may have sadly, because of this circumstance, an abundance of talent that starts to apply for it. Let me ask you a broader sort of budgetary structural question. Do you expect your budgetary situation to get tougher? And are you doing anything now to prepare for what might be belt tightening coming down the pike?
I guess my job always is to prioritize the work and try and be as efficient as possible for the taxpayer. So we're kind of always doing that and trying to really focus on what's most important and make sure we've got that most important work done. That's kind of the natural course of business. I think it's a little too early to tell right now what a future budget may look like or the future economy may look like. We're going to have to be prepared to be able to prioritize in a number of different potential futures. I haven't seen one yet, that I think is the answer because we're still, I would say, kind of in the midst of this. From my perspective, our biggest and most important thing is how do we steepen that recovery reset curve and get back on step as fast as we can. If we have a COVID, hangover, and we're trying to get work back, but we haven't put it on contract, and there's a lot of, delays downstream. That's just going to compound the impact, and that's really what we're trying to avoid right now.
Let me take you to the issue of production. The big companies are in pretty good shape, but everything they produce relies on hundreds, thousands of smaller contractors. And on that third, fourth, and fifth tiers, there is a lot of fragility. In fact, there is some fragility, as we saw, even at the prime level, where Boeing had to shut down its Everett facilities. Those have reopened, obviously very important for the Navy from a P-8 patrol aircraft standpoint. You said that, just as food supply chains are getting taxed, you've said that you're watching this very, very carefully because so far you're able to keep things on track because of inventory. Do you have any plans to step in? And do you think you'll have to step in somehow? And how do you step in if a COVID outbreak, for example, shuts down, what might be a critical manufacturing facility?
A very important question. And again, part of why I think, that we've always considered the defense industrial base part of our nation's critical infrastructure. We are seeing, I would say both temporal and geographic elements to this of smaller suppliers shutting down and then coming back up. We're watching that very closely on a daily and weekly basis and understanding that base. We are looking at a number of initiatives to bolster that industrial base. The Navy's always, I think, really been focused on the supply chain and the industrial base because we're so sensitive to it. And I think there are going to be areas where we're going to have to either do targeted investment or some specific actions at the supplier level. You'll recall over the last couple of years, both in the submarine and last year's surface side, we have money budgeted for supplier health and wellness. And so we're taking a hard look at where do we see fragility and making sure we're maximizing the dollars we already have. And then as we work on these, future stimulus inputs, indicate where additional dollars could help.
Two quick questions as we wrap up. You're eating through a massive amount of maintenance backlog. Anybody who's ever been in a shipyard knows that folks are working in close proximity. And there's this concern that ships were coming out of the yard not quite as finished as everybody would like them to be. You've put a focus on this to try to get ships out faster. How is that all going now? Because you did mention in your press availability that you thought that there were opportunities to actually both improve quality but also accelerate stuff coming out of the yard. Give us a quick update.
I haven't seen a drop off in quality either on the repair side or new construction side. Our newest Virginia fast attack submarines coming out with the highest quality score we've seen out of a Virginia class submarine. So quality is staying up. We do have to focus on that, absolutely. That just has a compounding effect if we have poor quality. And we're going to have to prioritize. As we work through the disruption, we've got to make sure we're focusing on the most important work. So we're working very closely with the fleets from that perspective. But having said all that, I think there are opportunities, as I said in this earlier press availability, for us to get to a better level on repair. We were doing outstanding work, seeing great improvements. Our challenge now is to continue to be on that path in spite of some new challenges and disruptions.
You've tried to exhibit a lot of leadership and demanded that your subordinates exhibit leadership as well, right? Everybody knows what commander's intent is. Go and execute. But in this period, there seems to have been a little bit of confusion, whether it's even to use the right kind of conference service or things like that. Do you think that people are stepping up and using the authority that you are granting them to execute and execute quickly?
I did a kind of a all hands virtual call yesterday talking to the workforce, and one of the things that was one of my observation was I can't think of a single thing in the last 6 weeks where I have had to reverse or question a decision. And we are moving at, rapid pace, making lots of immediate decisions. And so, as a leader, my job is to publish intent, right? And my intent's been pretty simple. Take care of yourself, take care of your team, take care of the mission, and then let me know where I can help. And I've been very actually inspired at the individual level all the way through the team levels for us to have accelerated 32% more contracts awarded at this point already this year than last year, with 5% less contracts to do it, is a pretty remarkable achievement. And so I publish the intent, but that's built on a culture of trust and transparency. And I've been really amazed at how well, whether it's in the industrial base side, in our own team, everybody is mission focused. They're taking care of themselves, and they're leveraging all the power of the team to get the mission done. Our sailors and Marines are still deployed around the world. We can't take a break. We can't let our guard down. We can't let the mission fail, and the team's really stepped up in an amazing way.
It really is extraordinary, sir. Thanks very much for your time. And by the way, I should say that was Vermont, which was the highest quality, and you also set a record for the first undersea commissioning of a submarine.
Yeah, USS Delaware, commissioned while underway underwater. And so, named after the first state, it was the first one to do it underwater. And we're very proud of both the shipbuilder and the team that built her, and then the crew that's operating her. And she's on watch now, help protecting the nation. So that was an awesome event.
And just for our audience, it was an action-packed press conference. We talked about the Ford, a lot of progress happening. The 5th elevator is of the 7 are about to be certified, so I thought I would mention that. Sir, stay well. Thanks very much for spending so much time with us. We appreciate it, and for being so open with reporters. Hope you, yours, and your team stay well, and look forward to connecting again soon, because there were a lot of other programmatic stuff that I wanted to ask you about, but we stuck to the big picture stuff.
All right, Vago, I look forward to continuing to work with you, and thanks for what you're doing for our Navy and our nation.
And now a word from our sponsor. The Defense and Aerospace Report is brought to you by the Bell V-280 Valor, bringing the mission technology of the future to the battlefield of today. Visit bellflight.com for more. And joining us now is our roundtable, Byron Callan of the independent Washington research firm Capital Alpha Partners, and Michael Herson, the president of American Defense International. Gentlemen, welcome back.
Great to be here, Vago.
Thank you for having me back on again.
It's always a pleasure. Hope both you gentlemen had great holidays. Michael, start us off. We are in a bipartisan squabble last week when you were on the program, as everybody was getting ready to go off for Passover and to celebrate Easter. It looked like we were on the verge of a deal, and no deal. Talk to us about what's going on, what the dynamics are, and what are the political points everybody is trying to score?
Sure. So I think, the Democrats and Republicans are playing a very dangerous game of chicken. I was very surprised last week that they did not pass what they're calling CARES 3.5, the bill that's kind of in between Stimulus 3 and Stimulus 4, to provide extra funding for the Paycheck Protection Program. $350 billion was initially appropriated for it in the CARES Act, which was the third stimulus. And by Tuesday, this week, 1.1 million loans had already been applied for. And as of earlier today, the program ran out of money. So the Republicans want to appropriate an additional $250 billion to keep the program going. However, the Democrats are looking to add more to that package to include assistance for hospitals, assistance for state and local governments, and more aid to the poor, like extensions of more money for SNAP. And also, they want to make sure that the Paycheck Protection Program financing includes money for minority-owned and rural businesses. And the Republicans in the House and the Senate have been refusing to budge. They want to pass a clean package. I thought for sure that there would be some kind of compromise last week or this week. But to no avail. The Senate actually convened briefly on a pro forma session about an hour ago, and they adjourned until Monday at 2 o'clock. So now the program is out of money until they can figure out what they're going to do next week. Now, the administration has been talking to the Senate Democrats about a possible compromise, which actually has angered the Senate and House Republicans because they feel they have the upper hand here. So, I've talked to a couple senators this week. I've talked to some leadership staff. I've talked to some congressmen, and no one really seems to know how this is going to end up. But somebody, I believe, is going to blink next week because we can't let this program run dry for too long because the damage is going to be too severe.
And there is a concern that a lot of stuff did fall through the cracks, that some of these packages weren't large enough. There's a very, very large block of funding in CARES that's for real estate developers, and yet which far surpass, I think the number was $150 billion, that surpasses the amount of money that's going, for example, to hospitals. The concern obviously being that this is going to get worse, right? I mean, the focus right now is on New York, but there is this concern that there are hotspots all across the country, and we're even seeing out in the Rocky Mountain states that perhaps could be, sort of tomorrow's hotspot.
You're correct. And, right now the Republicans are operating on the notion that the things that the Democrats want funding for in this package, including more aid to hospitals, are things that aren't needed at this time, that those funds are flush, and those are things we can deal with in the next stimulus package. So let's just pass this one quickly and deal with that in the next stimulus package.
Byron, how are defense contractors doing in the midst of this? You were quoted in a pretty good New York Times story that tried to give people a roundup of how people are thinking about this sector. Stocks have been doing pretty well.
Well, they had, because I think all the signs are pointing to, we're on the verge of an earnings season. Last Friday, the outlay data, the monthly Treasury statement came out. And so we got a picture of not just how March came through, but also we had the January and February data. So I think operations and maintenance outlays were up around 6%. The sum of procurement and RDT&E were up 6%. It's kind of striking how strong the March numbers were in terms of percentage increases over the year ago period. And I think, that suggests that some of the things that the department has been doing, to accelerate progress payments, for example, are working, and you probably get a better picture of this with the April data, because that's going to get another slice of the COVID-19 impacts. But I think, you know, I still believe that this sector can't completely self-isolate from the impact of COVID-19. There have to be some impacts on productivity in some of the plants, facilities, offices of contractors. And there may be supply chain disruptions. But I mean, you know, if you compare it to other parts of the industrials or capital goods segments of the stock market, I think defense, at least on a very short-term basis, is really going to shine here. But you know, as we discussed, I think what people ought to be thinking through is, okay, it's fine for now. It's going to get you through this quarter. It's probably going to get you through next quarter. But they're just an array of things that get unleashed by this, and I just can't believe it's going to be as simple as snapback to where we were in December or early January of 2019 or 2020.
The president has said that he will seize extraordinary constitutional powers, and it's debated about whether or not he can actually do this, to basically adjourn both the House and the Senate in order to sort of do what he wants, in part, you know, saying that I have to get my nominees through, and because of the pro forma process, I can't get my nominees through. And at the end of the day, there are not many nominees for the jobs that he wants approved anyway. How does that threat? I mean, is anybody on the Hill taking that threat seriously?
No, they're not. Actually, Politico early this morning did a really nice outline as to how difficult it would be and virtually impossible for the president to pull this off. They actually called it absurd. So, and there's been virtually no chatter on this today. And you know, again, it's you know, at a time in the middle of this pandemic, there's been some discussion too as to why the president's not focusing on nominees that really don't have a lot to do with what we're talking about. But you know, he is on a similar page to McConnell, because when McConnell sees the Senate eventually coming back, he wants to turn his attention actually to nominees before he turns attention to a fourth stimulus package. So I think they're looking to achieve a similar goal, but it's just how they're going to achieve it. But I think the threat of adjourning Congress is a very hollow one.
Let's talk a little bit about the fourth stimulus package, Michael, because you mentioned you know, that this current discussion is about. You mentioned that this current discussion is about 3.5. Talk to us about what's supposed to be in package 4, because I think that goes to the heart a little bit of the Democratic Republican problem here, which is, hey, you know, on the one hand, let's just do the Paycheck Protection Program and then worry about the broader economic package later, whereas Democrats want to sort of accelerate that conversation as well.
Well, I think, you know, in previous podcasts, we've talked about what Speaker Pelosi sees in this fourth stimulus package, and she's been the one really kind of driving this train. But and I think most people on the Hill agree that there probably will be a fourth. But the question is, what's it going to be? Is it going to be still focusing on the pandemic, or is it going to be focusing on recovery? And the only people we've heard from really on the fourth package has been the House Democrats. And like I've said on previous podcasts, they feel that this is really going to be dictated by the crisis. The president's talked about infrastructure, and the Department of Defense has been putting together their own lists in preparation for the fact that they could be included as part of a recovery package. But this seems to change week by week and day by day, and I think the enthusiasm around a fourth stimulus package is really starting to wane. And this is something that, if it were to come to fruition, they'd have to follow some of the processes they did on the third package, in the sense that have working groups together on different subject areas. Right now, there are no working groups in existence, so fourth stimulus package is still completely notional, and they wouldn't be able to pass that package until Congress is back in session, because this is not something that's going to pass on unanimous consent like it did, like the previous packages did. There'll be a lot of people opposed to these, a lot of people opposed to the spending in them. Democrats are not receptive to defense being part of the package. I've talked to leaders on both the authorization committees and the appropriations committees and the Democratic leadership, and they're very cool to the idea of defense being part of this package. So they're really on very different pages. So I wouldn't anticipate a fourth package being a reality until the earliest, the end of May.
Byron, how's the street looking at all of this? And what's your sense?
I don't think there's been a high expectation for much for defense. You know, no, I don't think people have really built that in. I think what they're really, again, kind of focused on is just relative stability right here. But my sense, you know, in the conversations that I've had, there's just not a lot of expectation that the DoD is going to, get a windfall, maybe a little bit, but it's not going to be a big needle mover.
And I just want to make sure that I double check my math. According to the Washington Post, of the $2.2 trillion CARES package, $170 billion appears to be a tax break that benefits real estate developers. The amount of money in the legislation for hospitals was $100 billion, and relief for state and local governments was $150 billion. And then, of course, you had the Paycheck Protection Program that was part of that also, which was the largest single component of that measure. At this point, there is a lot of debate and discussion about when to reopen the country. The death rate in New York City is still extraordinarily high, obviously on a decline. And New York State announced that everybody's got to wear masks to try to further mitigate the spread of the disease. The president wants to reopen as quickly as possible. He was originally talking about Easter. That's now been delayed. And he then last week, or I can't remember if it was earlier this week, said that he has complete authority to reopen the country, and it's up to him. States rebuffed him, constitutional scholars rebuffed him, his fellow members of his own party rebuffed him, and then said, okay, the decision will be left to the states. But then, interestingly, his supporters mobilized miraculously overnight and swarmed a number of state capitals, demanding that governors rescind stay-at-home guidelines and reopen their economies. How is this issue going to replay? Because for many of us, we have been sort of locked up, and we're locked up to wait for this crisis to dissipate so that we not only get infected ourselves, but then don't inadvertently become carriers of this disease. How is this dynamic playing out? Because for a couple of weeks, we've had people not necessarily following the government in some places and not following the government in others. What are the implications of this new sort of political dynamic, Michael?
Well, it's a really great question and tough to answer because there's so much uncertainty, and I think the uncertainty makes the economic situation worse. And I think it makes a lot of people's personal anxieties worse too. We may not know exactly when we're going to get back, but in some sense, we want to know how we're going to get back. And the president has announced that later today, he's going to unveil guidelines for reopening the country. I talked to one U.S. senator earlier this week with several of my clients, and he had a very different perspective. I mean, he basically says, look, we have to prevent more damage to our economy. So we've got to figure out how to get back to work and get back to work quickly. And we're kind of spreading out the virus. So he thinks, look, we're going to get infected, and that's just the way it's going to be. And we've got some experimental treatments that seem to be working, and, tough luck. That was kind of a dire message to most of the folks on the call. Other people taking a step back and don't want to go back to work until we know it's safe. We have a way to work safely. And frankly, that's the message that the president got yesterday from the CEOs that he convened on a call from 17 different industries, including defense. It said that they don't feel that their workers or their customers from all different industries they represent are going to feel safe until they know that there are specific guidelines that are going to keep them safe. Like, for example, we've already seen on the Senate side, they're talking about staff wearing masks, but senators not. Well, what's the point? If we're all wearing masks, prevents the transmission of the disease, but doesn't prevent you from getting it. Everybody's got to wear it. Everybody's got to behave like they're getting it. We've already seen the president talk about masks during one of his press conferences, but went off script and said, but I'm not going to wear one. Well, a lot of people are going to follow that example. And I think we've seen the difference too between guidelines and things that are enforced. And those things are going to have to be enforced at the state level, because when this pandemic first broke out, we had a lot of guidelines that people were not following. People were still going to restaurants, who were still going to bars, and that hastened the spread of the disease. So now we're going to have very strict rules in place as to what we can and cannot do. And I think that's what a lot of people are waiting for. And again, it's very different between where the Democrats are and where the Republicans are. And, actually, I see even some breaks on the Democratic side, just in the sense that Pelosi is itching to get back to D.C. Because she doesn't like the fact that Trump has the stage all to himself. So she's got to figure out how she gets her and her folks back to D.C. and does so safely. And earlier today, the Democratic chairman of the House Rules Committee released a press release on how to do remote voting. It's something that people have been talking about. And I've read the press release twice, and I still don't understand how they're going to do it. But they're trying to figure out a way that the Congress can function, get back, and still, without some members being here, still vote and get things passed.
Byron, you've been tracking not just the debate in the United States, but also sort of globally on what the economic expectations here are, and the International Monetary Fund and World Bank have a view here as well. Sort of like walk us through how you see this political dynamic and how you see the economic situation unfolding based on what we've seen so far.
Well, yeah, just to start with kind of a broader global view, the IMF, World Bank, this would have been the week they do their normal spring meetings in Washington, D.C. Of course, they were done virtually. They had a number of press conferences that they streamed, and then there are a couple of reports that were released, including the World Economic Outlook and the Fiscal Monitor, which are two reports that are done annually and then updated frequently by the IMF. I thought it was interesting in the World Economic Outlook, IMF called for a 3% decline in world GDP in 2020, and then that was followed by a 5.8% rebound in 2021. But, they called out the extreme uncertainty around their forecast. They didn't have any upside scenarios to that numbers. The two other scenarios that they offered were downside from that, and they included kind of a more extended rollout in 2020, a reemergence in 2021, maybe at a less severe level, and then a third scenario that was kind of a combination of those two numbers. So it's not a pretty picture. I thought the other part that was intriguing in the IMF Fiscal Monitor is, they talked about the increase in government debt really around the world, different countries, different regions, but they also specifically called out social unrest as a risk in their forecast. That the impact of COVID-19 and the responses that some countries are going to have. There's going to be competent and incompetent governments, I think, as we're seeing, and that could really ripple through a different set of social responses, particularly maybe as some of these lockdowns are eased and people can actually get out on the street again. We saw a lot of this in 2019. I just want to go back to Michael's kind of observations and your comments on this whole question about getting the economy up and running again. I'm in Vermont right now. It's obviously a rural area in a small town. The town I'm in, they had two of the early deaths in the state. And it's been pretty remarkable to see how quickly and how attentive people are here. Plexiglass shields went up in the general store very quickly. People wear face masks, not all the time, but it's very noticeable around here. And I kind of think, for the places in the country that haven't been through this yet, my son's had COVID-19, a very mild case of it, and my brother-in-law's father died. He was in a nursing home in Staten Island. That took him very quickly. I just don't think people can appreciate the impact until you actually live through it or experience it and see what it can do to families, to friends, to coworkers, colleagues, relatives on down the line. And so maybe, to the point that this has kind of been rolling out in different places around the United States with different frequencies, I do wonder, when that rush to kind of get back to work collides with, the actual experience of COVID-19, I think people are going to think twice about the rush to get things up and running here with no regard to what the human consequences of that are.
Yes, it's interesting that the Democrats are being somewhat more obedient than Republicans are on this issue, but I completely agree with you, right? I mean, I think that there's this sense that it's not going to affect me or it can be mild, and the trouble is, yes, for some people it is mild, for other people it's significantly more severe, and God forbid you've got any sort of pre-existing condition, then it could very well be a death sentence. And it's a very, very dangerous virus in terms of how it survives on surfaces and all of that. Before we part, let me just ask quickly, Michael, on the defense budget and where we are on the 21 discussion at this point, because there's also a little bit of consideration in talking about whether or not some of the stimulus money is going to apply to defense as well, which has some people in the department sort of thinking, okay, well, what does that mean for us? So let's just do a little bit of a roundup on that.
Sure. So the committees have continued to work hard to get their bills done for FY21. For example, the National Defense Authorization Act in the House, that bill should be written and complete by May 1st. Now, what they have to do is what they call stick it in the can, because they have to figure out how they go through the process of marking up the bill and then figuring out when they can get floor action. But that is the process that's going on also in the Senate with their authorization bill. They continue to move forward. I spoke to senior folks on defense appropriations earlier today. They're working on wrapping up their bill, and the same with the Senate. So these bills will be written. There are some challenges because they're doing as much from home as possible, and a lot of what's in these bills are classified because they're classified sections and classified annexes. So they had to actually get into the Capitol to work on those, and that's been challenging because they've really been limiting the access. But this process is going to go forward. The numbers will be, right now, from what we can tell, they're going to adhere to the budget deals that are in place. But there are some talks about some changes in the O&M world, because how much FY20 O&M money is not going to be spent as a result of the fact that we're not training as much, and fuel costs have declined. And the same to look at how much O&M we're really going to need as a result of that in FY21. So there's possibility of those counts getting shifted away and maybe into some other things too. And there will be also some focus on COVID-19 in the FY21 bill as well, regardless of whether there's defense in a fourth stimulus package that may or may not come.
Byron?
Well, it's interesting Mike mentions that, because I just saw there was a news report today that South Korea actually was cutting their defense budget. And part of it was just that reason that they had money that they had put aside for training and exercises that they're not going to spend. So they, in effect, were cutting the budget, to reallocate that money to the healthcare system. So I think that's kind of an interesting pattern, an interesting line to follow as FY21 moves through the wickets here. I don't know what Michael feels, but I still, I think just the calendar, I still think kind of, more and more it seems industry is kind of working with the assumption that we're going to start the year with a continuing resolution, and maybe a continuing resolution that's going to extend into 2021.
Well, so that's an interesting point. Right. So, even without COVID-19, we would have a CR in September to take us until after the election. So there's several schools of thought on the Hill. There are some that are saying, hey, maybe we try and get all this done by September because we don't know if we're going to be coming back after that. There's a lot of talk about a resurgence of the virus in the fall. And do we want to be faced with a government shutdown looming at a time where it's also hard for us to get back to deal with the CR that's expiring? I think that's likely the case we're going to end up in. I don't think they're going to be able to get all the appropriations bills finished and conference and out the door prior to them leaving in September. But look, stranger things have happened. And they are looking at adjusting some of the summer calendar to be here on weeks they weren't planning on being here because of the weeks that they lost. But I think that there is a possibility of a CR going into next year as well. We face that every year. But there will be a lot of pressure not to do that by the defense hawks on the Hill, because they know the damage that does to DOD, and DOD is looked at differently than the other bills. At the same time, there's this illusion of not spending money when you pass the CR. There's the fact that we have passed these stimulus bills, and maybe if we pass a fourth and we're now an extra $5 trillion in debt, there is some fear of the optics of just passing the regular FY21 bills that total up to about 1.4 trillion, that those optics might be damaging for them as well. So it's really a big unknown. It's going to be pressure from all sides. But that being said, at least the process is moving forward.
This is the first time where we can say, $1 trillion here, $1 trillion there. You're finally talking about real money. It's just the numbers are just stupefying. Just imagine, gentlemen, in the span of a little bit more than a couple of weeks, we've spent more than we did in Iraq and Afghanistan, and that doesn't include all the stuff that the Fed has been doing that's somewhat off book. We've got
while we were talking, the CBO released their score on the CARES Act. and they, the preliminary basis, the actual increase of federal deficits by 1.8 trillion over 2020 to 2030. But again, I think that's a pretty narrow definition of,
Right.
You've got, as Michael discussed, more legislation coming down, 3.2, 3.5, and whatever comes beyond that. I haven't seen any impact of the economic ramifications for this, what it's going to do to tax receipts.
Correct.
So,
And one friend who's an economist estimates that it's going to be could be as a $1 trillion decline in tax revenue.
Yeah. So
which is not unreasonable.
Right. I mean, you saw some estimates last week, early this week, kind of 3.8, 3.9 trillion. I still think we're probably, when you're all instead done with this, it's in the $4 to $5 trillion range.
And in 30 seconds, Joe Biden is the nominee, endorsed by Bernie Sanders, Barack Obama, Warren, and including a number of Republicans already.
Maybe contrary to expectation, the Democrats really have kind of rallied around, at least the people who ran against Biden have come to support him. I don't think it really changes the fact this is going to be a competitive race. And I think it doesn't change the fact that it's still going to be, really decided by the outcome in probably 6 to 8 states. It's going to have to be filtered through COVID-19 and what that does to the economies of some of those states, particularly Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania.
Can Trump, Michael, turn this into your Democratic governor is the villain here, not me? Vote for me because they destroyed your economy, your great economy, my great economy?
I think that's going to be very difficult. I think he's going to try. Look, we've seen this already. Every day he's blaming somebody else. Even one of his tweets the other day blamed Congress, that Congress should have been investigating coronavirus instead of focusing on impeachment at the time. So I don't think that flies. I think Byron is spot on. I think that regardless, this is going to be a close race. It comes down to 6 or 7 states. But as I've said before, it's a lifetime between now and the election. But I do think that the Democrats are smart. They've kind of come together in a short period of time. I think that obviously the current crisis has expedited that. But I think that they're in a strong position going in because they have a lot of ammunition to use against the president, whether it's his fault or not, that we're in the situation we're in, not only with the virus and the spread, but also the economic situation we're going to be in.
And Trump has not gotten the rally around the flag bump that you typically expect to see in a crisis like this. And that has been evidence for leaders in other countries. So I get it. Like there's a very strong base that supports him. That base is a very solid foundation, but I think it also suggests that there's a very solid ceiling too that he hasn't really shown that he can break through that yet.
Guys, thanks very much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Look forward to having you on next week.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And thanks for joining us this week. Please follow our daily interviews with top government, military, industry, and thought leaders at Defense and Aerospace Report, and subscribe to our weekly newsletter. Follow us on Twitter at DefAero Report. That's at DEFAERO Report. Like us on Facebook at Defense and Aerospace Report. And check us out on LinkedIn. Look for our weekly cyber report sponsored by Northrop Grumman. For more than 80 years, Bell has pushed past the boundaries of what's possible to drive aviation forward, going above and beyond flight, bellflight.com. Thanks again to Bell for their generous sponsorship, and we'll see you again tomorrow.